Funding for Election 2020 coverage is provided in part by AARP, a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership association, 86,000 strong in North Dakota. AARP encourages you to vote absentee or vote safely in person and make your voice heard. And by the members of Prairie Public.
Good evening. Welcome to Prairie Public and AARP North Dakota's coverage of Election 2020. I'm Matt O'Lean. This is the debate between the candidates for Minnesota's 7th District congressional seat. My guests tonight are Democrat Collin Peterson and Republican Michelle Fischbach. As you can see, we have socially distanced podiums to comply with safety measures regarding COVID-19. Each candidate will have a 1-minute opening and closing statement, and I will throw out topics in between for discussion. Based on the coin flip, Collin Peterson will go first on his opening statement. Congressman Peterson.
Well, thank you, Matt, and good evening, everybody. And I want to thank Prairie Public and AARP for sponsoring this debate. And I want to thank the voters and people of the 7th District for giving me the opportunity to serve them in Congress over these number of years. I've been there long enough so that I was able to move up to the head of the Agriculture Committee on the Democratic side in 2005. And I've been chairman twice. I think I'm probably the only person that's ever done that, that's been chairman of the committee 2 times. And we've been able to do some good work. We've kept the committee bipartisan, which is important to me, and I've been rated the most bipartisan member of Congress, and we've kept the committee that way. And we've been able to get the Farm Bill done that the President signed in 2018. We got the USMCA trade agreement done that people were concerned about, but we made that happen, and we got a good Democratic vote. So I look forward to going back to Congress and continuing the bipartisan work that I've done over the number of years.
Okay, Michelle Fischbach, 1-minute opening statement.
Well, thank you very much to Matt, AARP, and Prairie Public for putting this together tonight. I am Michelle Fischbach. I served in the Minnesota Senate. I was the first female president of the Minnesota Senate, and I was the lieutenant governor for a short time. I live in the Paynesville area with my husband, and we have 2 children and 5 grandchildren. And I've really enjoyed campaigning across the district and getting the opportunity to talk to people. And although the COVID shutdowns did slow us down, I stayed on the phone for a couple of months and made a lot of phone calls and reached out that way. So very happy to do that. And I think people were happy to get the phone calls because they were at home too. So I just want to make sure that we look to the future in rural Minnesota and in the 7th District, and that we make sure that we are making this a place where people can live, work, and raise their families, and make sure that we move things forward and we work on the economy. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight and looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, let's get right to it. And topic 1, of course, is COVID-19. Schools are starting to open with hybrid learning and things like that, and many people are getting back to work, but the issue has become political, and I want each of you to talk about first the U.S. response to the crisis, or specifically President Trump, and also talk about Governor Walz's response within Minnesota. Now, Michelle Fischbach, you start us off on this topic.
Well, and you know, it really is an issue that affected us all, and I will just say that, you know, I talked a little bit about the shutdowns and how it affected our campaigning. But I do think that in Minnesota in particular, you asked about Minnesota, I think in particular, we tried to put a one-size-fits-all policy on the entire state, and it didn't work for rural Minnesota. And we've really done some damage with in the ag industry, in the businesses, and we need to make sure that we are getting the businesses back open, and we're making sure that we're moving forward on that, because the things are depending on that, and the economy is depending on that. Make sure that we're opening those back up. Obviously, businesses, particularly in rural Minnesota in the 7th District, understand what it will take to keep their patrons, their customers safe, and they're able to follow the CDC guidelines, but let them get back to work, let them get people back to work. And I think on a national level, you know, the president has made sure that we shut down travel as soon as he could, and making sure that we're moving forward on a vaccine. And so I appreciate what he's done on the COVID relief, and we need to make sure that, that we move things forward and we open the businesses back up.
Okay, Collin Peterson, response?
Well, unfortunately, we're not out of the woods. When you can't keep the President of the United States safe in the environment where they're testing all the time and doing that sort of thing, you know this virus has not gone away. and it's a serious problem. And the people that work for the president, Dr. Redfield, Dr. Fauci, others say that the most important thing is to wear a mask, and keep socially distanced, wash your hands, and don't get involved in big crowds. Unfortunately, we keep sending mixed messages from the federal government. And I think it's a problem, and we have more cases and more deaths in this country per capita than just about any country in the world. So we need a federal response that's clear, that sends a signal to people that this is what we need to do to stay safe. In the state, I think I've talked to the governor a number of times. I think it was a mistake to have one size fits all for the whole state. I think up in this part of the world, alongside of North Dakota and South Dakota, we could have had different regulations, but the governor decided he wanted to have one regulation for the whole state, and frankly, I think it was a mistake.
Okay, Michelle Fischbach, you can respond.
Oh, no, I don't think so.
No more?
Bill. No more.
Okay, we'll move on to the next issue then. And let's stick with that in the stimulus package. Right now, talks are stalled, of course, in Congress about a second stimulus package. We may not have anything till after the election. What are both of you, your views on a second stimulus bill and the proposals that are out there? Colin Peterson, you'll start off on this one.
Well, we passed a bill in the House in May that I thought was overdone. I thought it was too much money, but the Speaker accepted our agriculture stuff that we had worked on in the committee, and because of that, I kind of held my nose and supported it because I knew it wasn't going anyplace. Now they've come up with another bill where they've dropped the price tag down to $2.2 trillion, and they've cut back on some of the ag stuff. But I just think that we have to focus on what the really important things are, and not just be giving out money to people, because we have to pay this money back sometime. So in agriculture, we have money for depopulating hogs and turkeys, for helping with the packing plants, for helping ethanol, things that are a crisis right now. And I think that this bill should focus on what is a crisis and where we can actually help. And so this last bill I voted against because I just don't think it hit the mark on what we needed to do. At the end of the day, there's going to have to be an agreement between the President, the Senate, and us. And I think it's going to be less money than what we've been talking about, and frankly, it should be.
Michelle Fischbach, response?
Well, the HEROES 1 and the HEROES 2 Act. The HEROES 1 Act, yes, I believe Congressman Peterson said he voted yes for it, and it was about $3 trillion worth, and much of it was not focused on COVID relief. And yes, there may have been some great ag stuff in there, but if it's not going anywhere, the agricultural provisions can be wonderful, but if it's not going anywhere, and that HEROES 1 and HEROES 2, those two bills are at a dead end. They have not been, Nancy Pelosi and DFL leadership or Democrat leadership pushed it forward and without negotiating or even talking to the president, without talking to the Senate, and these are dead ends. They are not going anywhere. They're not really trying to make sure that the American people get COVID relief, which I support. But they are putting together liberal wish list bills, $3 trillion, now over $2 trillion, that, like I said, include things like Planned Parenthood money and money for illegal immigrants. And what they need to be doing is actually getting to work and focusing on the COVID relief that the people need, and talking to the president, talking to the Senate, and moving it forward.
Colin Peterson, response?
Well, the Senate hasn't come up with anything realistic either. And the president has been back and forth. Right now there's talks going on with Mnuchin and Pelosi, trying to come up with a solution that everybody can support. But I would just have to say that, when you're working on these big bills and you get what you want in the bill, it's pretty hard to say, okay, you gave me what I want, now I'm going to vote against everything else. So I knew this wasn't going anyplace, so I just voted for it to keep this process going. So at the end of the day, the people that really need this help, which the hog farmers, the turkey farmers, the packing plants, the ethanol plants, are going to be in the final package. And I think they will be, because I stepped up to the plate that first time. This last time I had a long discussion with the Speaker and told her I thought this was a mistake what they were doing, that they shouldn't have put it on the floor because it wasn't going anyplace. It was partisan, and it's the wrong thing to be doing at this point in time.
Michelle Fischbach.
Well, I really do think what we need to be doing is stepping up, and if the Senate hasn't come up with anything, then the Democrat leadership in the House needs to be moving forward and talking to the Senate and trying to get these things done. And the ag provisions are still going nowhere because those two bills are not moving. And so what you need to do is make sure that Congressman Peterson, in the opening, you talked about being bipartisan. Then maybe what we need to do is move forward and be bipartisan on the Senate bill and talk to the Senate and the President.
Colin Peterson, do you have a response?
Well, I mean, we are bipartisan. Mike Conaway and every Republican on the committee supported what I did. You know, and so that, I don't know how I can be more bipartisan than that. And I am not in the leadership, you know, and I had a very tough discussion with the Speaker that she didn't like. And I told her what I thought, and, you know, that's how it works. Michelle knows that. She was in the legislature. You know, you can't, on these bills, you can't have everything exactly the way you want it. So we have been bipartisan, and at the end of the day, I think we'll be successful.
Michelle Fischbach, I'll give you a last word on this topic.
Well, I think the last word is that there is nothing happening on COVID relief for the American people. Those two bills, well, the most recent, HEROES 2, is not moving forward, and right now we do not have any COVID relief in the ag sector or for the American people.
Okay, we are going to get to ag very quickly, but first, next topic is the Supreme Court vacancy brought on by Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing. Now, Representative Peterson, you've introduced a constitutional amendment that would state only 9 justices can serve on the court. There has been talk that if Vice President Biden is elected, there could be a court packing. So this is really a two-pronged debate. First off, talk about why you propose this amendment, even though Michelle Fischbach will go first. And also, do both of you feel this nomination should be delayed till after the election or should go forward now? Michelle Fischbach, you start us off.
Well, first of all, I do appreciate the legislation not to pack the court or the resolution not to pack the court, because that is not something I support nor want to see. But I absolutely support the President moving forward with the nomination and the Senate moving forth with the confirmation. It's the constitutional duty to make sure that they do that and move forward and make sure that that vacancy is filled. And I think it is an important part of their duties, and they should do it. And I appreciate Amy Coney Barrett and think she will make an excellent Supreme Court justice.
Colin Peterson.
Well, you know, we were working on this bill before the Supreme Court issue came up. So Representative Riggleman and I had worked on this bill, had it ready to go, and we introduced it. So, you know, any of this talk of packing the court or trying to jury-rig things is a mistake. We have enough problems in this country. We have enough divisions in this country to not be doing that. So we introduced this constitutional amendment. We hope that we can get support for it. And I think 9 justices have served us well for a couple hundred years, and there's really no reason to change that. In terms of you know, this nomination, I know there are people that are upset, but the President wants to move it. It's his prerogative. The Senate apparently has the votes. It's their prerogative. And that's the way the Constitution set this up and the way things work.
Follow up on this. What is the difference then between this situation and the Merrick Garland situation from 4 years ago, which is what we hear from the Democratic side with the complaining? Michelle Fischbach?
Well, I will just say every situation is different. When there is a Supreme Court vacancy, and I believe that it is a constitutional duty for the President to go ahead, move ahead, and it is their prerogative, and they should handle it. Both the President and the Senate should go ahead and handle it.
Colin Peterson?
Well, you know, I think there's a fair amount of hypocrisy going on here, because you have people that took one position, Republicans in 16, and now they have a completely different position now. But having said that, again, the President has the prerogative to do this. They apparently have the votes. We'll see. And, you know, I'm in the House. We don't have a vote in this fight.
Okay. Anything else, or should we, okay, let's move to ag policy. Big issue in 7th District. Can each of you comment on how the trade and tariff war with China has impacted farmers both nationally and in the 7th District? Colin Peterson, you start this one off.
Well, it has not been positive. We are trading at about 25% of where we were before we got into this in agriculture. And the Secretary just said yesterday at a meeting he was at that they are not going to hit the phase 1 targets that they had set out there. And, you know, it's been a problem, because these prices, they've come back a little bit, but it's not been because of the trade situation. And my biggest problem with what's happening, I mean, China is a bad actor. And I voted not to let them in the WTO. I voted not to let them have most favored nation status, and that was the right vote because we knew at the time they were going to do what they did. You know, so if we'd have done the right thing back then, we wouldn't be in this predicament. And I don't disagree that maybe we need to do something to try to rein them in, but I think these tariffs have been a huge mistake. They have not worked. They have hurt not only farmers, they've hurt manufacturers, they've hurt Polaris, a lot of other folks in my district, and they have not solved the problem.
Michelle Fischbach, your response?
And prior to the COVID shutdowns and the pandemic, President Trump was making headway with China. And we all do know they're bad actors. They are bad actors. They are not trustworthy. But they have been ripping off the farmers and industry for years. And so President Trump took that step forward and started to deal with those things and making sure that we were going to be getting at least a fair deal and a decent deal. And so he did make that. And people understood that. People understand that China, and particularly now after the COVID outbreak and all the things that have been going on in China, people understand that China's not a good actor. But I think the president has been making headway and making sure that that we move forward with those negotiations. In addition to that, with the tariffs, the ones that are hurting the farmers are retaliatory tariffs from China, and that is where they're coming from. And I do understand that Congressman Peterson is going to talk about the tariffs and blame them on the president, but do understand he is trying to do what he thinks is right to make sure that we get a decent deal from China. And we do need to continue to expand our trade partners, whether it be Australia, Vietnam, Japan, but continue to move forward and expand our trade partners across the world.
Okay, Colin Peterson, response?
Well, I mean, I'm not blaming this on the president. The president is the one that put the tariffs on. And if you know anything about trade policy, you knew the Chinese were going to retaliate. The only question is who they're going to retaliate against. And what people need to understand, it is not farmers that were hurt over the 20 years that we've been trading with China. We actually benefited. We're the people that benefited from the trade that was going on because when the people over there, when we lost all of these jobs in manufacturing in Ohio and other places, they went in, the people in China they moved to China. The people in the country went in and took those jobs that used to be in the United States. They used to get paid $4,000 or $5,000 a month. They were paying them $100 a month in China, but the people moved into town, 300 million of them, and those people used to be farmers. And so then what happened is we sold farm goods to make up for the loss that happened because of that. So we had benefited. And it's hard to put any kind of spin on this, that this is somehow or another win for agriculture.
Michelle Fischbach.
Well, I think as we continue through, we will, the negotiations will continue and the attempts to make the Chinese create a fair trade deal will continue. And, I do think that President Trump understands what it is doing, and, he did create the program to help farmers through with the tariffs.
Okay, I want to also get to another ag issue. We'll start with you, Michelle Fischbach, on this. Of course, Congressman Peterson touts that he's the chairman of the Ag Committee. How, if you were elected, would you manage ag policy or try to move up the ranks of the committee chairmanships and things like this? If you were elected, how would you approach ag policy for the 7th District?
Well, I'll tell you, I do have, as we've mentioned, I did serve in the Minnesota Senate, and I did serve an area that had ag, and so I've continued to create those relationships with the farmers, with the farm groups, and continue that through. And we've already started an ag advisory committee that I deal with weekly in order to make sure that we are hearing what's going on in the field. And I think the most important part is making sure that you continue that conversation. We have a farm bill coming up in 2023, and we need to start that conversation early and learn what is important to the farmers and what they think is working and what they think they need. Not just someone in Washington, D.C. telling them what they need, but understanding better what's going on with them. And I will continue to make sure that conversation continues after I'm elected.
Okay, Colin Peterson.
Well, we're the 4th biggest ag economy of any district in the country. Agriculture is this district. And here in the Valley, the sugar industry is a huge part of our economy all through the whole situation. So because I've been able to be in Congress for a while, I've become the head of the committee. And that's a big deal in terms of getting things done, because the meeting doesn't start, any ag meeting in Washington and the House doesn't start till I get into the room. And it ends when I leave. And the secretary calls me all the time to talk to me about what he's doing. His people call me, run things by me. They ask my advice, I give them advice. That's something that doesn't happen with a rank and file member. Now, I went through this. The first 10 years I was ignored, basically. But I kept learning, kept working up the ranks, and eventually got into a position where I could do something. What I'm most proud of what I've done in Congress is I am respected all across the country by all of agriculture, both sides of the aisle, and I'll defy you to find anybody that won't say that I do a good job and I know what I'm talking about.
Michelle Fischbach, response?
No.
No? Okay, let me follow up this on ethanol policy within the 7th District and how that all plays out as well. Do you want to start off, Michelle Fischbach, on that?
Oh, certainly. I thought it
Yes.
was Congressman Peterson's
Nope, this is
turn.
kind of the same.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we'll keep going on this.
Well, certainly I have always been a supporter of ethanol, and in my time in the Minnesota Senate did make sure that we were supporters of ethanol, and we did what we could to help them in the Minnesota Senate. But I do think, I understand that the small refinery exemptions have been a problem, but the 10th Circuit most recently has found on the biofuel side, and so I think that is going to be you're going to be seeing that be taken care of. And I understand, I will do everything I can to make sure those small refinery exemptions are not abused. But I will say I think that the Green New Deal and some of the proposals and overregulation coming out of the Democrat side do more to hurt the ethanol industry than anything. That would eliminate a lot of the fossil fuel, and then there would not be anything to blend ethanol with if the Green New Deal is passed. And so I want to make sure that the federal government doesn't do anything to hurt the ethanol industry, but I will do whatever I can to make sure those small refinery exemptions are dealt with.
Okay, Colin Peterson, response?
Well, the Green New Deal I oppose as well, and it is dead as a doornail and is not going anyplace. So that's a debate we don't really need to have. The ethanol situation, I was there when we did the RFS, and the Speaker helped us get this done. And what it says is we should have 15 billion gallons of ethanol blended into the gasoline in this country. That's what it says. That's what the law says. We're at 12.5 billion gallons. And one of the reasons we're in jeopardy is because of that. We had the collapse in oil prices. People quit driving because of COVID. That is a separate thing, but you put that together with these exemptions and what we're doing, you have put this industry in jeopardy. And I was there in the room when we had to take this amendment that allowed them to have these waivers. And we objected to it at the time. And they said, well, this is only going to be small refineries. This is only going to be used under emergencies. And that's what it was until 2016. It has not been that way since President Trump has taken office. And it has hurt significantly. And I tried to find out, why did they give these exemptions? What was the basis for it? What was the rationale? They would not tell me. So in the HEROES Act, one of the other things I got in there was require that the administration gives that information in the future. So these things have hurt us. We just need to get back to following the law. The law says 15 billion gallons. That's it. If we had that, we'd be fine.
Michelle Fischbach, do you have a response?
Well, and I appreciate that. I understand, and those small refinery exemptions have been an issue, and we'll continue to work on those. But I do think we do want to mention that one thing that is overlooked a lot of the time that President Trump did do was provide for year-round use of E15. And so that is something that has moved things forward. But I understand that we need to make sure we do whatever we can to help the ethanol industry.
I'll give you a last word on this,
Well,
Colin
I'm for
Peterson.
E15 too, but you need to understand that unless we get the infrastructure to be able to get it out there, it doesn't do a thing. So you can't sell E15 in the current gas pumps. You got to get underwriting laboratory, you got to get the EPA, you got to get all these other people to sign off, the fire department, before you can sell E15. So it maybe help marginally, but it is not any kind of solution. And it's kind of a way for politicians to get off the hook. Again, all we need is to follow the law. Law says 15 billion gallons of corn ethanol. If we had that, this industry would be fine.
Okay, next question. The next farm bill, where does this stand? How will each of you approach this if elected? Colin Peterson, you start on this one.
Well, we're going to start in the next Congress working on it, as we always do. And we'll have field hearings. We'll go around the country. We'll have hearings in DC. And what I've insisted, and what I did back in 2008 when I did the Farm Bill, and what I will do again if I'm chairman, is have this bill developed at the subcommittee level. Now we have all kinds of new members on the committee on both sides of the aisle. And the way to train those people in and get them to understand the issues is to let them work in these smaller committees where they get an opportunity to be involved, to understand, to learn. And that's a lot of what we've been doing this last 2 years, is helping people to understand a lot of these issues. And we'll start, like I say, the next Congress in these hearings, and then we'll get into it in 2023. It's going to be tough, because farmers have gotten so much ad hoc money out of this administration that we will not have. We don't have that in the Ag Committee. We don't have that kind of money. We don't have any new money to spend. So it's going to be a difficult thing to do a bill when they've been expecting $50, $60 billion and we have no money. But we'll figure it out some way.
Okay, Michelle Fischbach, how would you approach this if elected?
Well, and we need to start early, and we need to make sure that we are talking to farmers and understanding, like I said earlier, what they need and what they want and what they would like to see in that. And make sure that we are looking forward, and that we are looking at what is going to help us in the next 30 years and how we can bring in new farmers and those young farmers, and making sure that we have opportunities for them to come into farming, and really moving the ag industry forward, and making sure that we are talking to people about that, and that we are creating, we're looking outside the box and making sure we're open to new ideas and new things that could happen within that Farm Bill, and that we are, like I said, moving ag forward and making sure that we have strong rural communities.
Okay, Colin Peterson.
Yeah, we've done significant innovation in the Farm Bill, starting in '08. When I created an organic local foods subcommittee, people thought I was crazy at the time. But organic agriculture has a profitable niche, and it's been one bright spot. So we've done that. We've got the beginning Farmer and Rancher program, which has been a huge success. And we've added on to that. We started in '08. We've added on to it in '14 and '18. So we've done a lot of innovative things to move in a different direction on the committee, without forgetting commercial agriculture, because at the heart, that's what feeds the world. And that's what runs this economy out in this part of Minnesota. So, I think we've been on the ball, and we will just continue to push those things forward in the future.
Michelle Fischbach, I'll give you the last word on the Farm Bill.
Well, and I will just say 2023 comes faster than you think, and we need to make sure we are working on it now, and we are getting the kind of input that we should have.
Okay, let's move on to a question from our co-sponsor, AARP. Social Security is a self-financed off-budget program that half of all seniors rely on for more than 50% of their income. If elected, each of you, how will you ensure that current and future Social Security benefits are not cut as part of deficit reduction? Michelle Fischbach, you start us off on this one.
And I will say it is very, very important that we protect the Social Security recipients that are receiving the Social Security now. That's very, very important, and we need to make sure that happens. But I think as we look into the future, we certainly can make sure that we have tax policies that encourage savings for retirement, that we are educating the younger generation about making sure that they save for retirement, and any kind of changes to the Social Security program certainly need to be bipartisan, and they need to be grandfathered in, phased in, so that people have time to prepare. But I absolutely believe in protecting the current recipients and what they are receiving, because it's not something that we're just giving them. They worked for that. It was taken out of their checks over time, and so we need to protect that.
Colin Peterson.
Well, there are potential problems on the horizon with both Social Security and Medicare. The funding is, different. You can talk to different people and they'll give you different dates. But, it is a concern. But I would not support any kind of cuts or any kind of increasing of age or any of that for people that are on Social Security. And we also have to make sure that the Medicare system is solvent. So in the case of Medicare, the 1.65% tax on Medicare applies to all of your wages. So if you make $1 million, you pay that 1.65% on the entire $1 million. And because of that, Medicare is probably a little bit better funded and maybe better for the future, but we have to make sure that that we don't let the costs get carried away, and that people are covered, and that we have pre-existing conditions covered. In the case of Social Security, there's been a cap. I think it's now 137,000 or something. So when you hit that cap, you quit paying Social Security tax, which is 4-point-something%. There are some talk about taking it off completely. I think that's probably, too much. But there are ways you could adjust that top cap that would extend out the trust fund for Social Security significantly. And I think we should look at that.
Michelle Fischbach.
Well, and I will just add, since Congressman Peterson brought it up, the making sure that Medicare is there for people too. It's very important to the elderly and to people rely on it and want to make sure that that remains those benefits. Although what I do not support is the Medicare public option, and I believe that most recently, I believe Nancy Pelosi and Senator Tina Smith have come out in support of that. And I think that actually those reimbursement rates that would be coinciding with those with that public option plan would be harmful to our rural hospitals. And so that is something that I would not support.
Colin Peterson.
Well, I oppose the public option as well, and I did vote against it when it came up in the House. But the bigger threat to our rural hospitals is not the public option, because I don't think it's going to happen. It is what they're trying to do with critical access hospital funding. Back in 2003, Bill Thomas came to me and asked me to work with him on his Medicare bill. No other Democrat would do it. I said, well, if you help me with critical access hospitals, I'll help you. He wanted to get Medicare Advantage, and the Democrats opposed it. So we went to work, and he put $38 billion into that bill for rural hospitals, critical access. We raised the beds to 25, and we had the reimbursement set at 101% of their cost. That saved these rural hospitals in my district. Half of them wouldn't be here today if we wouldn't have done that. It's one of the things that I'm most proud of in my career. So that is the biggest issue. Now the problem is the administration and others in Congress are trying to cut that 101% down to 90%. And that is the biggest threat to these rural hospitals that we have, bar none.
Michelle Fischbach, you have a response to that? And also maybe on the Medicare age, which has been talked about to be lowered possibly? Not sure where you stand on that, but we can get into that as well.
Well, I'd just like to address really quickly.
Yep.
I absolutely support the critical access hospitals and believe that those need to stay there. One of the things that has been difficult for the rural hospitals and has really hurt them was the Governor Walz's shutdown and ending any elective procedures by the hospitals. They didn't receive reimbursements. They weren't able to do any of the procedures, and they didn't receive the reimbursement, and that has made it very, very difficult for them. And it puts them at risk also, is that COVID shutdown and end of elective procedures. But as you take a look at the Medicare, we need to make sure that it stays solvent and that we do provide those. So whatever kinds of changes, again, they need to be bipartisan, just like they would on the Social Security.
Okay, Colin Peterson, I'll give you the last word on this one.
Well, I mean, it just, we have a good system. It works. It's saved these hospitals, and now it's under attack by certain people to cut back that funding, and that is the biggest problem facing us. I think the governor went overboard with some of what he did. I agree with that. But that's a state, and we don't have any control over that. And I told him what I thought, and he listened and didn't do much about it. But the biggest threat is the cut in these reimbursements. And the hospitals are not making a huge profit the way it is. And the last thing they need is to be cut back from what they've been getting.
Okay, let's move to our next topic. Even though the death of George Floyd did not occur in the 7th District, follow-up protests engulfed the nation, including calls in some quarters to defund police forces. I want to ask each of you your response to these protests, social justice discussions, racial disparity discussions, and how each of you feel about police funding or defunding the police, in whatever quarters that means. Colin Peterson, you start on this.
Well, I'm proud to be endorsed by the Minnesota Police and Peace Officers Association. And I got that endorsement because I support the police. We absolutely need the police, and without that, we got big problems. So I have got no problem with protests if they're peaceful and organized, then that's fine. But what went on in Minneapolis was not a peaceful protest. And I am opposed to the looting and rioting and other things that happened down there. And how that got out of hand, I don't know. But the people that represent that area, you know, obviously were asleep at the switch. And I feel sorry for the police having to try to deal with that, you know, in the midst of all that problem. So, you know, I'm not for defunding the police. I'm for supporting the police. I think there are instances where you've got some bad actors that maybe need to be called out, but I think they're in the minority, significant minority, and so I am one that does not appreciate some in our party calling for defunding the police. I think it's a huge mistake, and I've told them that.
Michelle Fischbach, your response.
And I will say, I think that the rioters, because so many of those instances, they were not peaceful protests, they were riots. And the rioters absolutely, positively need to be dealt with, and it needs to be stopped because they are looting and rioting and burning down businesses, and that is against the law, and we need to enforce law and order. And I absolutely support the police. I am proud to be endorsed by the Fraternal Order of Police, because in the Minnesota Senate I worked very closely with the police and appreciated their efforts, and the vast majority of police officers are good and decent people who are there to protect and serve, and I've been a strong supporter of police. And if you really want to help law enforcement and make law enforcement better, then we need to increase funding. We need to make sure they have the equipment they need. We need to make sure that they have the training they need, and they need to be paid a decent wage. And I worked with the police officers, the law enforcement officers in the Minnesota Senate to make sure that we could move those kinds of proposals forward.
And kind of a follow-up to this, do each of you, what do you think about racial discussions? Is there systematic racism in this country, or is it vary from case to case? Colin Peterson?
Well, I think it varies depending on what part of the country you're in and the, you know, what town or city you're in. I think there is problems. There's no question about it, because some of what's going on, some of this behavior is not acceptable. And as I say, it's a very small minority, but it's caused a lot of problems. And somewhere or another, we've got to get to the bottom of that, and we've got to have police departments that can get to the bottom of that in a way that's fair to everybody, you know, and it has to, you know, you have to be, everybody's got to have their due process in the process and not string them up, you know, because of whatever. So, you know, I'm just disappointed in the leadership in these areas where they're having these problems. Because I just think if I had somebody in a district in my, a city in my district where this was going on, I would be there myself and doing whatever I could to make sure it stopped, you know.
Michelle Fischbach, your response.
And if there is racism in a police department, I think that increasing the education, increasing their training, increasing their wages, increasing the help that we are giving those departments would certainly be able to root that out and make sure that they are dealing with it properly. But I absolutely, it's the riots that are a problem right now, because that's their response to what they consider to be racism, and rioting is not the way to address the issue.
Okay, let's move on. The EPA had been mentioned earlier. I want to get back to that. Can each of you respond to a recent report suggesting that President Trump had told the EPA to reject the small refinery exemption to the renewable fuel standard, and how would such a thing impact the 7th District? Michelle Fischbach?
Well, and I'm sorry, I guess I'm not completely familiar with the report that you're talking about.
Okay.
I didn't see that, and so I would be asking. You said President Trump. They are claiming that President Trump was told.
Right, and you talked about this in the WCCO debate, I believe, as well.
Okay.
So.
Well, if you're talking about the small.
Right.
You know, we talked about those earlier, and I don't know exactly what President Trump knew or didn't know, but I will say that I do not support the abuse of those small refinery exemptions.
Okay, Colin Peterson?
Well, it's hard to know what's going to actually happen out of this, because this is all happening because we have some senators, Republican senators, that are in trouble because of what the president did with these waivers. Joni Ernst is the primary example in Iowa. So this has been a huge political issue. Finally, the president said, okay, we're going to do something about this, but we're not going to do it till after the election. And he wasn't clear about what he was going to do. So I hope they actually do something. I hope they rein these things in back to what it was supposed to be in the first place, and that is it's supposed to be only, very limited circumstances. There has to be a valid reason for it, and it has to be small refineries. They gave exemptions to ExxonMobil for, that's not a small refinery, and that's what we've been complaining about. So I hope the president does do something about this, that he quits doing these waivers, that he orders the EPA, to do this the way they should be doing it. But we'll have to see, because it's not going to happen before the election.
Okay, Michelle Fischbach, and maybe a follow-up to that is the EPA overreach, which has been a big issue with the Republican Party, and how that has happened, and how would you approach that as well if you were elected?
Well, and I do think the overreach of those departments is getting out of hand, and we certainly need to rein it in. And if that takes specific legislation to do that, then we need to be doing that. But making sure that those departments are not overreaching with overregulation and doing what they are not supposed to be doing. And I think that was part of what the 10th Circuit did find.
Okay, Colin Peterson, last word on this.
Well, I've been trying to rein in these agencies, along with John Kasich and Rob Portman, going back to when they were in the House, for a long time. And it is a tough job to rein those folks in because of the way the law is written. And they actually have the ability to make law, to legislate. And they've set themselves up into a situation where it's hard to get at them. And they're clearly out of line on some of this stuff. The EPA, but probably a bigger issue in my district is the Fish and Wildlife Service. Those people are out of control. And they're out there shutting off drainage in people's farms. They're causing roads to be washed out because they won't deal with what's going on with their land that's up against a road. They've been a huge problem. And I've had meetings with the top Fish and Wildlife people 2 times in the district, and I've gotten nothing out of it so far. So these agencies are out of control. They're doing things I don't agree with. They're taking permanent easements. They're buying land. I don't agree with that. I think that it's 30 years is plenty long on any kind of an easement that the federal government takes. And so I've been doing what I can, but it is a tough job trying to rein them in.
Okay, another question from our co-sponsor, AARP. Americans pay the highest prescription drug prices in the world. If elected for each of you, how would you fight to cut prescription prices for all Americans and, of course, 7th District voters? And a follow-up, how would each of you approach national health care policy if elected in regards to either tweaking or eliminating the Affordable Care Act? And Colin Peterson, you start on this.
Well, first of all, the Affordable Care Act is not perfect, and I didn't vote for it. But once it became law, it covered pre-existing conditions, which is a huge problem in this country. So that was one good thing that it did. It did a lot of other things that I had a problem with. So there's been attempts to repeal it since then, and I have not supported that because nobody has come up with a credible plan to address the pre-existing conditions and the other problems that people are having getting affordable health care. So it's a system that I don't think is the greatest in the world, but I don't see an alternative at this point. And until I can see an alternative where people can buy something affordable and cover their pre-existing conditions, I think we should improve the existing system.
Michelle
and not
Fischbach.
try to reinvent the wheel.
All right, response, Michelle Fischbach.
And I do not support Obamacare. I would have supported the repeal of it. And as for pre-existing conditions, of course, I support coverage for pre-existing conditions. And I will tell you that my work in the Minnesota Senate, Minnesota had a program that was working to cover a high-risk pool. It was called MCHA. But Obamacare eliminated that and made us get rid of that and go into the Obamacare model. And so that program that was working and serving people and covering people in those high-risk pools was eliminated. And I think that there are things, certainly, Obamacare, they claimed it would cut health insurance costs and things like that, and it didn't do it. And so it's obviously needs to be repealed, and we need to start over. But I will say, in the meantime, there are things that we can do. We can make sure that association health plans that allow people to come together, whether it be small businesses or the self-employed come together, make sure those are strong and that they are able to use them. Increase increase the use of health savings accounts, make sure that there's transparency in costs so people know what they're paying for health care and the procedures they're going to have. There's another simple one, just making sure that individuals who are buying on the private market pay pre-tax dollars for that health insurance, just like the people who buy or get their insurance through an employer can do. So there are things that we can do to improve on what we have. Although I do not support continuing Obamacare, I think we should eliminate it.
Okay, Colin Peterson,
Well, as I
drug
said,
prices too. Let's talk about that.
Affordable Care Act isn't perfect, but the administration and the Republicans in Congress have not come up with an alternative at this point. And I'm not going to vote to get rid of it unless there's an alternative that I can understand and I think is going to work. That hasn't happened. So we're dealing with what we're dealing with. In terms of the costs in the system, you had mentioned earlier about drugs. I think that's a big problem in the whole medical system because the drug costs are out of control and they're unaffordable for a lot of people. The only thing I can see to get this thing back in line is to allow people to buy drugs over the border, because they're a lot cheaper in Mexico and in Canada, and that would be probably the biggest thing we could do to bring these drug costs down.
Michelle Fischbach.
Well, and there may be issues with buying across the border because we don't know exactly what they're getting and if they are properly looked at. We have the FDA here who handles those things, and so I would be a little concerned about encouraging people to purchase drugs across the border. But I will say President Trump has done several things in order to help bring down those costs, and he's put in place a couple of executive orders. One that eliminates the rebates on some Medicare recipients. He also provides insulin at a low cost to low income, and he does allow for the importation of some drugs from Canada. But I do think there are things that we can do, things that he has done, but we need to continue to make sure that we are addressing that issue. And, like any discounts that are negotiated by pharmacy benefits managers should certainly be passed directly on to the consumer. So there are things we can do to improve. But we have seen those prescription drug prices flattening out. We saw a lot of increase over a decade, but now they have been flattening out the last few years. And some of those things that President Trump and some of the other things that we can do to move forward as we continue to work on that issue.
We're getting near the end, but just get back to COVID one more time. We'll start with Michelle Fischbach on this. There's no vaccine yet. Schools are kind of open and kind of not open. It depends on the week, it seems like. And businesses, of course, were severely hit by this. What is the balancing act moving forward until there's a vaccine with businesses, schools, keeping people safe? There's been talk of a national mask mandate. Michelle Fischbach, tell us your thoughts on this, how we move forward until there's a vaccine.
Well, and I think just to mention the vaccine, there are several companies working on the vaccine, and so we need to make sure that we move that forward, and I know that they are working on that, and it will certainly go through FDA trials before it gets widespread use. And I don't support a mandatory vaccination. I think that that's up to the individual. But as we move forward, I think what we need to do is make sure that we are not doing that one size fits all that's been done in Minnesota, and that we are allowing businesses to open back up with what they feel is comfortable for, what they're comfortable with and their customers are comfortable with, while following the CDC guidelines. I think as we social distance and things like that, making sure that people are comfortable. But the one size fits all is a problem, and we need to tailor that to areas of the country and areas of the state.
Colin Peterson.
Well, I think it's obvious. The only way we're going to, and I hope and pray we have a vaccine. That is going to be the best solution. Now, it seems like it's going to be a problem because half the people say they're not going to take one because of all this stuff that's been going on. But that's probably our best solution in the long term. In the short term, I think it's very clear what has to be done. In order for us to get these businesses open, we have to wear a mask, we have to socially distance, we have to stay out of big crowds, and we have to wash our hands. And that's what these doctors have told us. And I think the biggest problem is the federal government has not been clear. So the CDC put out these guidelines, and you got people in the federal government saying, well, they don't mean anything. You don't have to follow them. That's a huge problem. So I just don't see how we get these things back in line unless we have people pay attention. The airplane. They've been telling people, when you get to the destination, don't get up. You know, wait till the people ahead of you get up, get their stuff, are moving down the aisle before you get up. What happens? You get to the gate and everybody gets up and everybody's in the aisle and jostling each other and getting their stuff out. People are not listening, and part of it is because we haven't sent a clear message.
Michelle Fischbach, has there been mixed messages from the federal government or the state, or what's your response to that?
You know, I guess I have seen that they've been pretty consistent on what's going on. I understand that there has been changes. I won't say that they have not made changes as we learn more about COVID and about the spread. And so there have been changes in what the recommendations are. I will say that one of the policies that I think accounted for many of the Minnesota deaths was the policy in Minnesota that would send COVID patients to nursing homes. And I think that's one of the problems, is we are not protecting the vulnerable like we should. We should never have done something like that. What we should have been focused on is making sure that the vulnerable population was protected instead of sending in COVID patients. And that did account for many of the deaths, I think the majority of the deaths in Minnesota. But I do think that, you know, as people, as the people understand the CDC guidelines and should be following them.
Collin Peterson, last word on this.
Well, I think I've said it.
Okay. Last issue before we get to closing statements. As you talk to voters, what are the single one or two top issues for 7th District voters? Collin Peterson?
Well, it depends on who you're talking to.
Yeah.
I jestingly say that with farmers, what they ask me is, are we going to get another check? How big is it going to be, and when is it going to come? And that is a problem because we got the farmers kind of off of the government, you know, dole, ad hoc deals, and now we're kind of back into it. But people are very concerned about COVID and about the fact that we're not getting this under control. You know, and I hear that from people. You know, they just can't figure out why the United States of America, the most powerful country in the world, the most resources of any country in the world, you know, why didn't we have a test right away? You know, why didn't we do some of the things that we should have done? You know, and how could we now be still in the middle of this far into the situation? So that's, you know, the COVID has kind of taken over everything. You know, and you can't get out and campaign like you did in the old days. There was no parades, there was no fairs, it really limits what you can do, and it also limits what Congress can do, because the way the Congress is operating now is a big problem as well.
Michelle Fischbach, what are the issues that you consider the most important among voters that you've talked to?
Well, first of all, we had a couple of parades. We were at Goose Fest
Yeah,
parade,
well,
so we had fun.
We were at the Goose Fest, you know, and there were a lot of people there.
Yes, there were. It was fun.
I hope there's nobody gets sick out of it.
But, you know, I will say what I'm hearing out there when I'm talking to people is the economy, is making sure that we get the economy going again. We make sure that we are moving things forward, because things were going so well before the COVID. People were at work, there was low unemployment, and so they want to see that move forward and make sure that economy is strong. But in addition to that, and we talked a little bit about it before, law and order. They want to make sure that the stuff that's going on in Minneapolis is not going to happen in their backyard or in their city. And so those are the two things that I see that people are really concerned about right now, that they're talking to me about a lot.
Okay, let's get to closing statements. Michelle Fischbach, your 1-minute closing statement.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much. Thank you to Matt, thank you to AARP, and thank you to Prairie Public, and thank you to Congressman Peterson for being here tonight. I really appreciate it. And I will just sum up by saying, you know, we really do need to look at the whole picture, you know, ag industry, manufacturing, their needs for housing, their needs for workforce, their needs for broadband, and those things that can make the 7th District a great place to live and make it a better place to live and make it a place that will move into the future where people can live, work, and raise their families. And that's what I'm hearing when I'm talking to people, is making sure that we are able to maintain our way of life and able to stay here in rural Minnesota and live our lives. You know, this is the most important election of our lives. This is going to determine which direction our country goes. And I want to go to Washington, D.C., and I want to fight for the 7th District. I want to fight for our rights, and I want to fight for our way of life in the 7th District. And I ask for your vote this election, and I thank you so very much for listening in, and for Matt and for the others for putting it together. Thank you.
Collin Peterson, 1-minute closing statement.
Well, again, Matt, thank you. AARP, Prairie Public, and Michelle, thank you for being here tonight. You know, my official title is Representative Colin Peterson, and I take that very seriously. This is the only job in the government where you can't be appointed. You have to be elected to be in Congress. And a lot of people don't understand that, and that really is something I think is special. And so I take this seriously. I approach my job as a representative of this district. I'm the guy that goes to D.C. and takes our concerns to D.C. And I work with whoever's there. So I have to work with Nancy Pelosi. I don't agree with her on most everything, but she's the speaker, and if you don't work with her, you're not going to get anything done. But I work with John Boehner. He and I didn't agree on much, but we could work together. I work with Paul Ryan. I work with Hastert. I work with Gingrich. That's what you have to do as a representative of this district. I've always done that. I've done it in a bipartisan way. I've worked with people on the other side of the aisle, and I think we've had some good success in terms of what we've been able to do for this district, whether it's the sugar beet industry, whether it's disaster programs, whether it's the farm bill, whether it's the trade agreements. You know, and I look forward to doing that in the next Congress, and I'd appreciate your support.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Representative Peterson, for being here. Michelle Fischbach, thank you as well for your participation. Thank you for tuning in to Prairie Public and AERP North Dakota's production of Election 2020. Election Day is November 3rd, and early voting is underway. So long. Good night.
Funding for Election 2020 coverage is provided in part by AARP, a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership association, 86,000 strong in North Dakota. AARP encourages you to vote absentee or vote safely in person and make your voice heard. And by the members of Prairie Public.